Hello, I'm Sean Murray, and this is The Conversation, where we take an alternative look at political events and current affairs through an Irish lens. In this show, we hope to pick, probe, investigate and uncover the stories that you want to hear. We go where mainstream won't go. This week, we will be speaking to an acclaimed academic and author who has been at the forefront of numerous high-profile human rights fights for justice. Now an adopted son of Belfast, he's never found wanting when his wisdom or expertise is called for local or grassroots communities. But before we do, let's get a quick overview on this week's topic.
On the 15th of April 1989, a severe crush in two central pens at Hillsborough Stadium, Sheffield, led to the deaths of 97 Liverpool fans. It occurred as the FA Cup semi-final between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest kicked off. Shortly before kick-off, the inexperienced match commander, Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield, with a clear view above the terrace from the police control box, ordered exit gate C to be opened to ease crowding at malfunctioning turnstiles. Fans, unstewarded, entered through gate C and down an unlawful 1-in-6 gradient tunnel headed standing. Yet the pens were already severely overcrowded. Fans were trapped by high fences to the sides and to the front. So severe was the crush, a barrier collapsed and bodies piled up. In addition to the eventual 97 deaths, 766 fans were injured and thousands traumatised. The deadliest tragedy in British sporting history. In the immediate aftermath, South Yorkshire senior police officers and the Police Federation fed false stories to the media, claiming violent Liverpool fans, many without tickets and drunk, had caused the disaster. These allegations persisted throughout a hostile media, despite Lord Justice Taylor's 1990 interim report finding the main cause was the police failure to control the crowd. Yet, there were no prosecutions of police officers or public bodies, and initial inquests returned an accidental death verdict. This led to a 3 decades-long campaign by bereaved families and survivors. Addressing the 20th anniversary memorial at Anfield in front of a crowd of 30,000, the Culture Secretary, Andy Burnham, committed the Labour government to full documentary disclosure by all organisations involved. In 2010, the Hillsborough Independent Panel was appointed by the UK government to oversee and analyse the disclosed documents and publish a detailed report. On the 12th of September 2012, it published its report. It launched a website containing extensive material collated from 85 organisations and individuals over 2 years. The panel concluded that the behaviour of fans in no way contributed to the disaster. The main cause was lack of police control. Crowd safety had been compromised at every level, despite previous near-death incidents on the terrace. The panel concluded that up to 41 of those who died might have survived had the response of the police and emergency services been appropriate. Before a packed House of Commons, Prime Minister David Cameron apologised on behalf of the government. Ed Miliband on behalf of the opposition. Other authorities, including the South Yorkshire Police, followed suit. Former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie, initially apologised for making false accusations under the headline The Truth. Subsequently, this was moderated. New inquests were initiated lasting 2 years. The jury concluded all who died had been unlawfully killed, and the fans were exonerated of any blame.
And with that, I would like to introduce my next guest. Professor Phil Scraton has been a leading light for those challenging corrupt institutional power structures. Widely known for his work on the Hillsborough Independent Panel, a team that was instituted to oversee the disclosure of documents about the disaster that led to the deaths of 97 Liverpool fans in 1989, he has been at the centre of many other successful institutional findings since. Phil, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sean.
So Phil, tell me first of all a bit about yourself growing up.
Well, I was born on the other side of the the river from Liverpool in Wallasey. My mother was from Birkenhead, a Birkenhead Catholic, an Irish background. My father was a Liverpool-born Protestant, and so I was the product of a mixed marriage, and so understood right from the outset the issues that, the tensions that exist around religion, particularly the tensions between Irish Catholicism and English Protestantism. And my father converted actually, but never went to church. And I grew up in not a very wealthy family, but somehow one of the only handful of people from my school. I got the 11 plus, went to a grammar school, which I hated from the moment I walked in. It was a former public school, and it had all those traditions. And the young ones got beaten by the old ones and all of that. It was a dreadful introduction to the world of immediate power relations on that level. And it worked at two levels. Once I felt that subjugation because I was a Catholic in a Protestant grammar school. But I also felt the subjugation of poverty. I came from a home where my mother and father had to scrimp just to get me to the school, to buy the uniform, for example, and all the gear that goes with that. So I felt lost, and within 2 years I'd left. And believe it or believe it not, these days I went into a seminary. I'd been an altar boy since I'd been very young in the local Catholic church, and yeah, the priest would come round every Friday night and they'd talk and chat, and they got me to play for the local church team and all of that. So my first love was football and Liverpool FC, which I know won't go down that well with you, Sean. But that was my first love, and second was, I suppose, I was devoted to the church. I mean, I was 8, 9, 10, 11 when I was on the altar. So it seemed obvious to me that maybe going off and trying to emulate the priests that I so admired at that time, that was why I went into the seminary. There was also at that time another formative moment which never left me, and which I should have realised even at that age was the real contradiction. There was a wee fella in my church, in my school, who was really poor. We weren't well off, but he was really poor. And he used to steal from the local shop, but he didn't steal sweets, and he didn't steal lemonade. He stole food. And that food he would steal to take to his family. And this was the first time I ever experienced anything like this. Later in life, I went through this again. And he got caught. And I'll never forget the day all the girls were taken out of assembly and all the women teachers left the assembly. And we sat cross-legged on the floor. And we didn't know what was happening. So there was a bang at the back of the hall, and we were sat there rigid, and these two teachers walked up. They looked massive from where we were. And Frank was walking between them. And they got him up to the stage, and the head teacher was on the stage, the deputy head, and the local parish priest. And the head teacher looked at all of us and said, "This week, Frank Ruddy was found stealing, and he is on this stage because of that. He let himself down, he let this school down, he let his family down, but most of all, he let God down." And they took him, they bent him over a desk, and they caned him 6 times across his backside, and they marched him down from the stage, and as he walked past, the tears were streaming down his face. Otherwise, he was emotionless. I sat there terrified. In fact, I was holding on to myself. I thought I was going to wet myself. And I learned a lesson that day, that moment, which didn't really click for a while afterwards. It was about the use and abuse of power, physical abuse of power. And that stayed with me. Even after that, when I went to the seminary, that stayed with me. And I saw that sort of behaviour again in the seminary. And I lived for 4 years in under that fear, in that kind of situation. And also in the seminary, I was very well aware that some of my friends were being abused. And I left the seminary in 1966. In fact, I will never forget the moment I left the seminary. It was like a massive pressure lifted from me. It also coincided with the World Cup, and I went to Goodison Park three times to see the Brazil match, the Portugal match and the North Korea match. And that was my first and last experience of Everton's football ground. Of course, I was never missed across the park at Anfield.
Well, we both have many discussions on the rivalry between Everton and Liverpool, but we'll save that for another day.
Yeah.
So tell me, Phil, how did you come to work and live in Belfast? Because you're now an adopted son.
After I got into academic work, and that was a strange experience in itself, because when I was finishing university, my first degree, which was sociology at Liverpool University, the thing that was said to me straight away was, what do you want to do? And I said, oh, I'd like to be a researcher. And basically, the career guidance guy who was in the School of Sociology smiled and laughed and said, no, I don't think you'd be cut out for research. I think you should go and be a social worker or a teacher or whatever. And nothing against social work or teaching, but I really wanted to do research. And so I enrolled for a master's by research. And I did it on the Irish-born Liverpool travelling community. And I witnessed there some of the worst racism I have ever seen. I come from a city where racism, particularly institutionalised by the police on the Liverpool-born black community, is really serious. But this was of a different order, seeing people dragged from their trailers in the middle of the night, their families. And I suddenly thought, am I a researcher or am I a witness to what is state abuse? So I wrote all that up, and that kind of steered me then into work in academic life, where the research was always going to be geared to abuse of power. And that work went on all the way through from that period, all the way through my work on institutionalised racism on Merseyside, my work on deaths in custody, my work on a whole range of controversial topics, which included eventually disasters and tragedies. And it was against that background that my, for want of a better word, career developed. I worked at the Open University full time, then I worked at Edge Hill University, Liverpool University, and then I came to Belfast. I remember after the interview, I was travelling back to Aldergrove, and I was in the taxi, and the guy said, what have you been here for? And I said, I've been over for an interview. And he said, what on earth do you want to come to this place for? That was his response to, you live in Liverpool, why do you want to come here? And I thought to myself, this is a crazy question, because in my head, and I'd been coming here, I'd been at Failure a lot, I'd done a lot of different things here, different talks, and I knew quite a few people in Belfast. And to me, I saw it as a privilege that I'd been offered a job in Belfast. Because when else in your life would you have the opportunity to live and work in a place that is going through transition from conflict? This is on my doorstep. People in England had not even the slight, I'm talking about generally, had not even the slightest notion of what was really happening in the north. And from my point of view, to come here and to work in this environment during a period of transition, and this was a period when, as you will remember only too well, 20 years ago, when there was a lot of tension, particularly in the paramilitaries, amongst the loyalist paramilitaries. There was a lot of tension, and it was getting a lot of headlines in England. But to me, it wasn't about that. To me, it was about being part of the society which was really going to face major transitions. Because I think when people talk about the transition from war to peace, what they fail to think about is, at a distance, it looks like the war is over, peace prevails. Everything changes. Well, it doesn't. We all know that is a complete myth. Anybody who's lived here knows that that is a complete myth. Because in that situation, intergenerational trauma becomes such a powerful force. People who've been in prison for long periods of time, people, hardly a family that hasn't, in working class communities, hardly a family that hasn't lost somebody or hasn't witnessed some of the worst examples of power being directed against them individually, whether by paramilitaries on the one hand, but most significantly by the state, the armed forces. I never forgot the moment when somebody said to me, one of the very first times I came here, when I went to school, she said, every day I came out of my house, I had to step over a rifle because we lived in a corner house. And the squaddy would be down with his rifle across the front of the step. And I had to step over that. That image stayed in my mind of a child. You know, I mean, yes, we all know the major atrocities. We all know the major conflict. We all know the situation of shootings, of bombings, and all the rest of it. We know that. But that one image of a young child stepping over that barrel every day and it being normalized as part of her life really stayed with me. So arriving in Belfast and witnessing and listening to people's stories, there was some of that was part of my own history, but not to the depth, not to the real pain of everyday life that had become normalized. And that to me was so significant. And the realization, working as I did with families, by that time families of the bereaved, families of prisoners, in a broader sense, that to me really had an impact, because what it was saying to me was, you know, this is an issue that's not going to go away in the medium period. So when people talk about transition from conflict, they have to understand that transition takes 3 generations minimum. I see that with my daughter-in-law, who was born in the former East, in Berlin. I see it from her family's experiences, that you don't unlive the lived lives of your grandparents, of your parents, simply because you're born at a moment of peace. And you inherit that background, you inherit that suffering. The things that are said and left unsaid in families are all part of that history. So for me, I work around the issue of about 3 generations when we can start to put real meaningfulness on, yes, the society has transitioned. And it's not just about who's in power and what their histories are. That's part of it. But it's actually about personal experience.
I completely agree, Phil. And there's something that struck me. Me and you had a conversation one time about mention. I know we have all these cliches and all these buzzwords around the peace process, etc. But I'd said to you, we've been talking about something that mentioned, you know, a post-conflict society. And you stopped me and you says, it's not, we're not in a post-conflict society, we're still in conflict. Yeah. And like it made me think, and you're absolutely right, to think that we were able to talk about a post-conflict society when there's so much trauma in our society still, when the injustices are still there, when the state is redacting documents, when they're burying the truth, when they're changing laws so families can't get to the truth, killing civil cases, inquests. We're not even into the period where there is a post-conflict society. I think the British government is fighting a war on a new front against victims and survivors. So it did strike me when you said that, you know.
The inequality of arms that exists during a period of conflict, let's be clear about this. The inequality of arms is about a state intervening in a conflicted society. The state is not neutral. The state is never neutral. The state always supports a status quo which it considers is in its own best interests. And I'm talking here about, not just about individual politicians, because there have been some good individual politicians, but I'm talking about the British state as an entity. And it has to protect its history. It has to protect its own direct involvement, not only in the deployment of the military in the north, but also its own, it has to protect its reputation in terms of being seen to be value neutral, which it never was. It's not only in the north, which is the north of Ireland, which is in itself a major, major issue in terms of state involvement. But you see it at every level in the work I do, where the state interests, whether they're the police, the prisons, whatever, the state interests are always protected. So getting to the truth in the north is something that is not in the state's interest. To have the whole truth and nothing but the truth will never happen. I'm convinced it will never happen. In the work I do, not just on the north, but in the work I do, I see redacted documents. I see what it means for those in authority to go through documents and strike out passages. I've seen what it's like. I'm talking here, for example, around Hillsborough. I mean, these are 97 people who die at a football match, right? This is not about a civil war. This is about people dying at a football match. And I've seen how a panel of carefully selected police officers under the direction of the chief constable go through the statements of all of their police officers and review them and alter them. Now, review and alteration are not my words, they're their words. That's what they set up. So if you project that from 97 people dying at a football match into a situation where you have a war, where you have a relationship between the military and the police, why would we be surprised to discover that documents go missing, documents don't exist that should have existed, that when those documents are found, that they are redacted, that they are changed? Why would we be surprised? If it can happen in the event of protecting reputations around policing football in a peaceful society, a harmonious society, why would we be surprised that during a time when the state itself is conducting a war, when there is military on the streets, when the helicopters are flying in hour after hour, why would we be surprised to find that the truth is redacted in statements, or it's never written, or it's hidden? Doesn't surprise me in the slightest.
You led the research on the Hillsborough Independent Panel, which the findings were released in 2012. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
When I came to Belfast in 2002, I felt I'd gone as far as I could. I'd written 2 major reports on Hillsborough. I'd written the first edition of Hillsborough the Truth. And to be quite honest with you, Sean, when I left Liverpool, I felt I'd failed the families. I came and I thought, it's over. Every avenue has been driven down and it's come to nothing. The Lord Justice Stuart Smith, who was a bastion of the British establishment, had been through all the documents that I'd uncovered, and he said that he found there was nothing other than matters of concern. He was talking about reviewed and altered statements, changing the truth. And he named me in his report. And I came away thinking, I've just got to carry on with all my other work. So there was a fallow period during the 2000s when I was working still with the families, but I didn't feel that there was going to be any future. And then in further investigation and inquiry. And we got to the anniversary, the 20th anniversary. And Andy Burnham, who is now Mayor of Greater Manchester, and at the time was Culture Secretary. He got up in the House of Parliament and he said he was determined that there was going to be a new investigation into Hillsborough. And Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, and he convinced Gordon Brown that this would be the way forward. And the Hillsborough Independent Panel was initiated. And two senior civil servants came to Queen's, and they said that the families had put them under a lot of pressure for me to be on the panel. And they thought I'd be immediately impressed. I gave them 7 conditions for being on the panel, and they accepted all of them, one of which was that the research would be independent and it would be based at Queen's, so that I could retain direct control over the research process itself and the researchers. And so for 2 years we had the full-on research process. We took evidence from over 80 different organisations, the written evidence from over 80 different organisations. We got all of the revelations of the statements that had been made, every single statement, thousands. I mean, I'm talking about 20,000 statements. And of those statements, the ones that we really wanted to home in on were the statements of the police and all others who were in authority at the time. I've got one bundle of material at home which came from one of the organisations. It was actually, believe it or not, Sheffield Wednesday Football Club. The game had been played as a semi-final between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest, which was held at a neutral ground. And that neutral ground was Sheffield Wednesday. And they felt they had a lot to protect, which they did, about the decrepit state of their stadium. I still have this document. It's about 200 pages long. And on each page, all but maybe 2 or 3 lines are redacted. That came to the panel. I mean, that was just from the club. So you can imagine how it was for all those others in authority, because we weren't only questioning the police now. We weren't only questioning the club, we were questioning the FA, the Football Association, who were the organisers. We were even questioning the ambulance service. We were questioning the fire officers who were intervening on the day, the architects of the stadium, the surveyors. And of course, what we found, I mean, in all of this, the local authority had not had a valid safety certificate in place for 10 years before the event. So you can see the range of liability that was underpinning responsibility. So people think it was a crowd, it arrived, it was badly managed, they went down into the stadium, a crush ensued, people died, and therefore the responsibility was about the poor policing and organisation. But it was much deeper than that. It was much wider than that. And that's what we had to work on. And so myself and the research team of 4 based at Queen's worked on all the documentation for 2 years, and we wrote the Hillsborough Independent Panel report. And it took the lid. Its multiple findings took the lid off every aspect of Hillsborough. And I've never forgotten, by this time as a Tory government, I've never forgotten Cameron, after we launched the report in the Anglican Cathedral in Liverpool. Cameron came on the big screen from the House of Commons, which was packed. There was standing room only in the House of Commons to hear the report. And he made a double apology. The first apology he made was apology for what had happened to those who died. In other words, that all those institutions had some part to play. The major part was played by the South Yorkshire Police. They were the most culpable. And he made that apology in a packed House of Commons. And then the other apology he made, which is one that was really important and significant, was he apologised to the families and the survivors for the 20-odd years of suffering that they'd gone through, where they knew the truth, but the truth had never been acknowledged. And their reputations had been absolutely castigated in the media. They had been destroyed in the media. They had to see their loved ones' reputations, that they were drunk, that they had alcohol problems, that they stormed into the stadium, that they arrived late. They did all, none of which were true. And he had to apologise for all of that, for allowing that to go forward and to victimise or re-victimise. And again, there is a parallel to the North, where you re-victimise families by, first of all, not accepting the truth and the responsibility, but by transferring the responsibility and blame onto them, that somehow it's their loved ones who acted in a reckless or a violent way. And that is where I would draw. I mean, obviously there is no parallel to be drawn between a war and Hillsborough. There's no parallel to be drawn in real terms, but there is in terms of the way in which the authorities respond to cover their liability. And that to me was an example writ large, you know. And when you actually get a document, which is a House of Commons document, that it has been limited in terms of who has seen that. It would only be civil servants who've seen it. And you're sitting there at your table in your kitchen reading this document, and you see the statement that's being made by a civil servant relating to the then Home Secretary, Jack Straw. And I'm not talking at the time of the disaster. I'm talking down the road when there was the Stuart Smith inquiry, the late 1990s. And you see that document, and in the margin is written, "See Jack, ask him to reconsider this sentence," in Tony Blair's handwriting. That moment is the moment when you realise how the negotiations are really being conducted. And I've got to say, you know, this is not a right-wing Tory government. It was a relatively right-wing Labour government. But at the same time, you would have expected better. You'd have expected, and of course the projection by Jack Straw, the projection by Tony Blair, we're doing everything we can for the families, doing everything we can for the survivors. So the point of dwelling on Hillsborough is, if you're prepared to go to that extent to hold the truth back from public reality over deaths at a football match, you know, you don't have to think twice. Nobody living in the North has to think twice about how that projects onto a civil war situation when you have troops on the streets, etc.
So just on that, for the audience's sake, I know that there were 2 documentaries made on the Hillsborough disaster. The first being from Jimmy McGovern, I think it was around 1986, if that's correct.
Yeah.
And then the Don Gordon documentary, which was based loosely on your book, is that correct?
Yes.
I know from looking at it from a filmmaker's perspective, I saw that there was great comfort given to the families in that we see the impact that the documentary and film can do here to help victims and survivors, particularly in cases where institutions are covering up the truth. So before you speak about that, I just want to show the audience Don Gordon's trailer.
By the time I stopped, I was right near the front.
The crowd sort of convulsed, and then something went.
As I walked down the steps, I could see my dad lying on the floor.
And he said he's dead. And so I just lifted his T-shirt over his face.
And there were just these lines. And lines of dead people.
Families felt somebody's going to be held responsible for this. Didn't happen, did it?
Police officers said that we had to give a statement.
A lot of the questions were about drink.
This chief inspector turned around and he says, "Don't bother putting anything in your pocketbook." Fuck him. There's been scores of people killed here.
Why are they attacking me? Why are they attacking my family?
Signed it, submitted it. That was the end of it for me.
Even before the bodies are pulled out, the world knows that a tanked-up mob had actually caused the disaster.
It's all about the drink.
The myth begins with the lie.
It's a question I've always asked people about the stealing from the dead, the urinating on the police. I always say to them, would you do it? And they'll go, no. I said, then why would you believe I did it?
You've got a fight ahead of you. I think the families realise that straight away.
The overall conclusion is that there is no basis on which there should be a further public inquiry.
I thought there was nowhere else for me to go.
And then I had a phone call. The South Yorkshire Police said the panel in its work would not find a smoking gun. It could not have been a more flawed assumption.
When he showed me my Hillsborough statement, well, there were two.
The weight of what had been discovered and how far it had gone.
What did you say about what's happened today? Got the bastards.
Altering a person's statement is a criminal offence, and I don't like criminals.
Have we found anything new? 3 words I will say to you all. Yes, we have.
Take the gun!
In the chaos of Hillsborough, there is just the truth.
Yeah, a very, very powerful representation of what had happened that day in April 1989. How did the families respond? I mean, obviously they're both documentaries, but I mean, given that Dan Gordon's was loosely based on the book, and I know it came at a time when, you know, it's 20 odd years later, how did they respond to it?
Before I talk about Dan Gordon's film, I just want to make a mention of Jimmy's film, because that came based on 4 families' experiences, and it came out of the blue for many people, and it really opened up. I'd written Hillsborough the Truth, but you know, more widely, the population don't read that, but they do see a drama documentary that goes to over 50 different countries, you know, to be screened, and that made a really big impact, because it was the first time that you had verbalized and shown a different narrative, and that was so significant at that time. In actual fact, the person who worked on that, who was instrumental in that film being made, Casey Jones, the late Casey Jones, went on to become a member of the Hillsborough Independent Panel with me years later. The documentary that was made by Dan Gordon was a documentary that wanted to tell the whole story, that was directed like Hillsborough the Truth. It was based around Hillsborough the Truth, and it wanted to tell that whole story from the beginning right the way through to the panel and what came about as a consequence of the panel's findings. And that was a really significant shift in the narrative, because this was a film that was going on general release. It was shown on BBC television. It was it drew widespread acclaim, and it won the BAFTA, that year's BAFTA. And for me, that was a real vindication to the public of all the lies and all the deceit and all the insults that have been thrown, often in popular discourse, often by the media. I don't just mean The Sun. The Sun led the way in condemning Liverpool fans and condemning Liverpool people. But all the other newspapers, bar 2 or 3, all the other newspapers carried that narrative, the narrative of condemnation. And this changed the public perception completely. I mean, of course, there will still be chants, there will still be comments made at football matches, etc., about Liverpool fans and about the tragedy. But the narrative on a grand scale was changed completely by that. And that was really significant. And I think the role of film, as an academic who uses film a lot and contributes to films a lot, I can see that in half an hour or an hour or an hour and a half, however long it is, you can get to an audience that I can only dream of in terms of any of the books that I've written, you know, and you get to them in that instant, and it changes the narrative, because it's not only the film, its production, its audience. It's also that it's written about. It's also that it's picked up by the media in the broader sense. That is so significant for me. The use as an academic, the projection of your work, and I'd go in all the range of my work, where it's on children and young people here in the north of Ireland, or it's on prisons, or it's on Hillsborough, or it's on any of the other tragedies that I've been closely involved with. I can see quite clearly that I have to work on several fronts. If I want to have the research findings that come out of my work broadcast and understood and taken into the public domain.
I completely agree, Phil, and I've always been an admirer of your work. And we have recently, although we've been friends a few years now, we've recently been working together on a case for young Joseph Rainey. Do you want to tell the audience a bit about that?
Joseph was a young fella, like so many young fellas in Belfast, who was out and about with his mates, just involved in the usual sort of low-level stuff that young fellas get involved with. And he was, and he comes from a family that is just a lovely, lovely family, and Joseph himself was a lovely boy. If you actually look at the history of him going to the United States, visiting families there on exchange deals, all of that, he was so highly respected and highly regarded. But like so many of us, and I would include myself in this, there's a moment in life, usually in your mid to late teenage years, when you're finding your own way, you go off the rails a bit and all the rest of it. And I have to say that, you know, there was a moment in my life that was like that after I'd come out of the seminary. So, you know, it's not that I'm sort of above all of that. And he was trying to get into a shop in Belfast, and he got caught and he got taken into police custody. And there was a realization when he was in police custody that he was vulnerable. And so they held him longer than would be normal, because they would normally pass him straight on to the Young Offenders Institution to be held on remand while his case is progressed. So they held him, realizing he was vulnerable. He was then committed. He went into the Young Offenders Institution. He wasn't properly processed. The processing took under a minute. The forms weren't filled in appropriately and fully. He was put on a landing. He went onto that landing. He was obviously in distress. He asked if he could phone the Samaritans. You don't need to be a genius to work that one out. He's on the phone. He comes back. He's up and down, you know. Then he asks for a pen and paper. I can hardly believe I'm telling this story, because it's the warning signs are so great. He goes to his cell, and he's last seen writing on the paper. He was writing a note to his mother to say why he was about to take his own life. And when it was seen through the spy hole that he'd upturned his bed, he was hanging from sheets, they got him. He wasn't quite dead. They got him onto life support, and out of his cell onto life support, and eventually they took the machine under the direction of his mum and dad. They took him off life support. Now, there is no question that this was a suicide. But when we talk about suicide, when we talk about people who take their own life, I don't like the word suicide, because it reduces everything to the same. Whereas when people take their own life, they take their own life in a different context. They take it for different reasons. They're under pressure for a whole range, and there but for the grace, you know? It's as simple as that. And from my point of view, it became really important that an inquest would be held that would get into the details that surrounded his committal to prison, that surrounded his death. And that, in fact, eventually, after fighting for the inquest and having a really good set of lawyers to work with the family, it was absolutely clear, because let me just make a point. An inquest is not allowed to establish liability against an individual or an organization. It can't say this person or this institution caused this death directly. What it can do is show the context of death, which illustrates the same issue. And for many years, I'm a founder member of an organization called Inquest, and for many years, we fought for the possibility of having riders, that is, additions to a short verdict. So it was obvious this short verdict was going to be suicide. But now we had a situation where the jury could make a whole series of observations about how that suicide came about. And what it demonstrated in the 14 or so comments that they made, it demonstrated the abject failure of the prison service and the healthcare service within the prison. The abject failure in terms of the death of Joseph. For Tom and Sarah, his father and mother, for his family, and for those who knew, his friends who knew him well, this was so important. Because what it demonstrated was that, yes, of course he took his own life, but it was the context in which he took his own life that created the situation. And that, to me, is what an inquest can deliver. It's a perfect example of what we fought for years, that although nobody will be personally held responsible for his death, the responsibility lay with the organisation that was holding him. And that can be extended to hospitals, that can be extended to any situation where your life and your future is in the hands of an organisation. And my work on the Coroner's Court across Ireland, the Coroner's Inquests across Ireland, my more recent work on that has been to demonstrate how there are so many cases where we now need to revisit those cases, or we need to set up for future cases a situation where they will be examined in full with a thorough appraisal of how institutions operate. Now that is seen as a real threat by the professional organisations, but so it should be. It's not so much a threat. What it is to ensure that there is compliance with best practice. Yes, there will be accidents. Yes, there will be problems that will occur in all of these situations, which are beyond the control of those who are responsible for the safe passage of that person. But from my point of view, the institutional failings have to be revealed in order to develop more appropriate ways of dealing with people, whatever institution it is. I would extend that to all institutions. But the most obvious is prisons, because in that situation, you're under the total control of an institution. And therefore, that is really important. That is the groundbreaking, from my point of view, that is in the north of Ireland, that is the groundbreaking result of the Rainey case. And the family have to be not only admired, but they have to be applauded for what they have, the contribution they have made to this society, to ensure that in future there will be thoroughness, detail, and care taken in the examination of deaths in contested circumstances.
We're going to show a clip, a trailer, in fact, of the short documentary, My Name is Joseph, that we both collaborated on. And in this clip, you will find, which is absolutely extraordinary, the findings of the inquest. So we'll just get a look.
On the 7th of April 2013, Joseph was in the shopping centre in the centre of Belfast. The shops had closed. He broke into one shop and attempted to break into others. First of all, the security saw him on CCTV, and then the police were called. The police took him into custody. This was a normal, routine, everyday occurrence that we would see in terms of policing in any city. However, it turned out to be one of the most contested and controversial cases that I have witnessed over all the years that I've worked on contested deaths in custody, Hillsborough, and a whole range of other circumstances.
So, I mean, you've dealt with many, many cases. You recently wrote up the report, the Champions League final report, but this was a case of a young man from Belfast, but the repercussions were massive. Do you want to tell us about that?
The significance of the findings were massive. First of all, and I never lose sight of this, my first responsibility are to families. So to ensure that a family has the truth, as much as can be uncovered, has the truth and has the full understanding of the context in which their loved one died, that to me was crucial. And in all my work, that is the first responsibility I have. But the truth is also about accountability. The truth is about holding institutions to account, whether they're private institutions or they're state institutions, but most especially if they're state institutions. Because you and I pay our taxes. You and I pay into a system that is there to safeguard our interests, all of our interests. So the state is ours, or should be ours. And when state institutions renege on that, that to me is a further injustice on top of the injustice that happened in the first place. So what was so important about Joseph's case was not only that the family had the truth, because they knew the truth deep down, but they had public acknowledgement of that truth. That truth is now there in every newspaper, on every television program. That's the first issue. But the second issue is that all of the cases that come after that have to be dealt with through the processes of investigation, inquiry, inquest, etc., with the same rigor that that eventual inquest was conducted, the same rigor. That is so significant. That is a major contribution to the society in which we live. So whether one person dies or 97 people die, what is so significant is that the processes of inquiry, investigation, and I suppose the outcome, that process is correct and accurate. And that's where our work, where my work is most centered. It's most centered on ensuring that we gain appropriate systems, appropriate structures that hold the state to account, and other institutions. But I'm particularly concerned about state institutions because they're our state institutions. They belong to us. They're not private institutions. And that to me is part of what we mean when we talk about public accountability and we talk about public access to justice.
Phil, I want to thank you again for coming over to this side of the city to see me. You're always welcome, and it's always great to have you here in the West. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean. Thank you.
And that does it for another week. We'd love for you to join the conversation by sharing the link to today's programme to help us grow our audience across all our social media platforms. I'd once again like to thank our special guest, Phil Scraton. In the meantime, the conversation will be back next week with more investigations and analysis. I'm Sean Murray. Bye for now.